Welcome back to another episode of
Gay Isn't Stupid.
We're your hosts, Isaac
and Aaron.
And we're really fucking stupid and really fucking gay.
Woo-hoo!
So, Aaron, want to tell them what we're going to be talking about this month?
This month, we're going to be talking about some of the struggles faced by the trans community in the prison system. And some of the things that can lead to like a cycle of trans people being arrested and the consequences that can have for us afterwards.
So we're going to start with kind of how trans people are targeted basically for them to end up into the like prison system and all that. The justice system really has like an overpopulation of trans people being represented in it. From this specific survey we're looking at, which I believe is from 2016, the percent of adults reporting the time that they spent in prison and jail, 21% were trans women, and all U.S. adults only reported back to 5%. For trans men, it was 10%, and all trans people and gender non-conforming people, it was 16%. But I really want to focus on that 21% for trans women, because they are definitely the most targeted of trans people when it comes to kind of corralling them into this corrections system and stuff like that, because of how vulnerable they are due to factors like family rejection and homelessness and unsafe schools and discrimination in employment and housing and like legal documents and healthcare. And most of the profiling that also gets them arrested to put them in the system is mostly targeted at trans women, because the criminalization of sex workers is where a lot of them find themselves. Yeah, so trans people are kind of just a big target, and I don't think that's talked enough about. Like, we know that like in jails trans people aren't treated very well. Like, that's something I feel like everyone just has like the common sense to realize, but I don't think a lot of people know about how they are targeted to put them into these spaces specifically. And the police are a big part of that, because police aren't trained properly. They don't give a shit really about like the person, especially if like they take your driver's license and they're like, you look like a lady, but it says here, stuff like that. Profiling is a big problem, because a large majority of the trans women who are put in the criminal justice system are trans women of color. So not only are they being profiled because they are not white, but also because they are perceived to be trans while they're walking, which is another thing that police will stop for. Especially because whether or not they do work as a sex worker, if they see somebody and they're like, oh, that looks like a transsexual, they're gonna still stop no matter what. And then
in turn, eventually they can be stopped by my fists.
Yeah. And so you don't just get arrested and go straight to jail. You know, like, you usually go to court, or there's some sort of process you go through. I'm not super versed on the justice system.
I think you have to go to court because everyone has a right to a fair trial.
Yeah. Courts also fail them, so it pushes them either further into, because like, sure, you would think, well, even if like the initial arrest and the initial situation is put them in a system where or a place where they could end up going to jail, the court, as if it did what it was supposed to do, it would realize these people are innocent. But it doesn't, because the court staff and the juries can be transphobic, and there's nothing you can do about that. So, yeah, so like, especially for a lot of...
Probably could do something about it. They just don't want to.
Yeah, they don't want to. They don't care. So not only could you be dealing with a transphobic judge and transphobic jurors deciding your fate, but also legal staff, because a lot of trans people, due to the circumstances that originally pushed them to be in court, such as homelessness, like employment discrimination and stuff like that, it is very likely for them not to have the funds to hire their own legal representation, so they just get a public defender. And because those aren't really vetted and they're just kind of handed out so that they can say, oh, you got your representation, trans people even face discrimination from their own legal defense, which can harm them because of the way they will then talk about the person they're supposed to be defending. There is one story found in this document about African-American trans girl named Destiny. She's 16 and she first became involved in the system at age 12. And she had been going in and out of it for shoplifting women's clothes, jewelries, and picking fights at school due to transphobia and stuff like that. She never committed any like violent or sexual offenses, and court ordered that she go to the highest security juvenile facility for boys because no other place would take her. And so she was incarcerated. She was sexually assaulted, physically threatened, harassed by the staff, and punished for her being trans. And she was given a court-appointed attorney who never advocated for her once. The attorney just continually refused to advocate for her or to take her abuse in the system seriously. And when Destiny tried to appeal for a new attorney, someone that would actually support her, they denied her. They said no, too bad, basically. And when they would go to court and stuff and she'd be with the attorney who was transphobic and against her, the attorney would say things like, I think this young man has a lot of things. And I use the word man to think about. So I just asked the court to be cautious in decisions they make, and would not respect her identity, and said she was exaggerating about the abuse. And he wanted to keep her in the facility. Like, he advocated to keep her in this youth boys facility where she was experiencing this abuse and where she didn't belong because, again, she was a girl. And that's like not an uncommon story. This is just one that was pointed out, but like there's such a high rate because they don't have the money due to class and other discriminatory policies that they are just basically being fucking, I can't think of a good way to word that. Basically, it's called the justice system doesn't care about us. And it's just, God, it just makes me angry. Like, that's a 16-year-old girl.
I was just going to say, they're just basically like trapping people by discriminating against them socially and then using any like creative methods that they might find to lessen those effects or to liberate themselves as an excuse to put them in prison where they have complete control over them.
Yeah. So I think that kind of wraps up all I really wanted to say about like how trans people are getting pushed into the justice system, because like the other things I feel like a lot of people will be aware of, and I feel like there's something we'll end up talking about more in the future. But I'm just trying to stay more on topic, like with the unemployment rates and like being turned away from housing. You basically just need to know the rates are ungodly high for trans people, specifically trans women and trans women of color. The rates of them getting denied healthcare, housing, employment, and they are more targeted by drug laws and discriminatory sex worker laws than literally any other group in the U.S. Yeah, in short, you just need to know that the criminal justice system is basically just fucking chasing.
Disgusting.
True, is just chasing fucking trans people into jail. And then the first part of the system fails them, and now trans people find themselves in prison. I'm pretty sure I stated this before, but it's pretty fucking common sense to know trans people are abused in prison, specifically trans women. And so I'm not going to go too into detail about how the assault rates and the abuse rates from both other inmates and like the prison staff are higher for trans people, because I feel like that's something that like, again, we all just kind of like are aware of. But there is one story that I wanted to share about a trans woman who was put into prison. Her name, Leslie Webster, is a Black trans woman, and she was put into a male prison facility. And this is what she had to say about it. they couldn't decide if they should put me in with the women or the men. So they put me in a pod called mental health, where they put transgender women. While I was there, I got disrespected a lot by the police officers because they would call me sir instead of miss. They cut all my hair off and they locked me in a cell for 90 days by myself because they didn't want to put me with the men and they couldn't put me with the women. And that is the end of her quote that she said in this article. And I think, do you have anything to say about that quote, Erin? I'm drawing it.
Oh, I was just going to say, when I read that, when you sent it to me, I thought the part where she talks about them cutting her hair really stood out to me.
Mm-hmm.
Because, like, that is just the most, like, unnecessary and, like, it's just the most unnecessary bullshit, like, obviously intended to, like, degrade her, you know?
Yeah. And I think this is also, her quote is also a good segue into like the main topic of like in-prison discrimination trans people face that Erin and I really wanted to highlight, because not a lot of people are aware of this as much as they are the other issues, is the lack of access to hormones and respect. Because I know a lot of us don't know things, and we see one thing and we just think that makes enough sense. So like, I know a lot of people have seen Orange is the New Black. Their trans character, I believe, got hormones. Yeah,
Yeah.
she did. And so a lot of people just accepted, oh, they get their hormones. That's not true for the most part. I have a chart up. It is only a chart of 21 states that follow the PREA standards, which is the Prison Rape Elimination Act.
It has these regulation, like, standards for how you're supposed to treat trans people in prison and how prisons are, like, supposed to treat trans people. And basically it's not it's not advocating for like trans rights or whatever. It's literally only saying you have to do these things so that trans people aren't like raped and murdered in prison. That's like basically what it's saying.
And they
like, these are the things that you have to do.
And they still are, because the criminal justice system, at the end of the day, does not fucking care. So this website does have a chart, has a couple charts where it lists out the 21 states and then like has like the different things that PREA like kind of said. So like there's things like segregated housing, separate showers, no searches to establish genitals, training, and stuff like that. But we're going to talk about the staff policies and the healthcare access by state. I'm not going to list all the states that are here. This will be linked in our further readings because it's a really nice visual. So out of the 21 states, there are only 5 states out of the 21 that they take a look at that provide access to hormones. And then 2 of them only allow it if the person was prescribed the hormones before they were incarcerated. And then the rest of them just say fucking no, which is weird and really scary, because that means also if they went in with hormones, they no longer have access to it.
Which can have like some serious health risks.
Yeah, it can. Suddenly things are going to be happening to them that they haven't dealt with before. Prison system isn't notoriously good for handling inmates' health in the first place, so these new health problems that the trans person might not know how to deal with, this problem also like just feels bad, Scoob. None of the prisons, states provide access to top surgery, so breast implants or like mastectomies. Only one, I believe one. Yeah, only one provides access to bottom surgery, SRS. And those are kind of the big ones. Okay, I just wanted to establish that. So I don't really know what I'm supposed to say about that. Like, I feel like it's just like kind of like, oh.
It's just kind of fucked.
Yeah.
Yeah. I definitely I think that just flat out denying those things to a trans person is probably like the most cruel and inhumane form of punishment that you can inflict on that person.
Mm-hmm.
It just, because when you need those things and you don't have access to them, the hopelessness that you feel when that is out of your control is just completely fucking devastating. Like,
Yeah.
there's like not really a way to fully articulate how that feels.
I think another lens that also has to be considered when like thinking about this, like there's always going to be some asshole who's like, well, they did something wrong, so they really should be punished. Which, like, okay, if you go to jail, I don't think if like you're diabetic, the prison guards are going to go like, no insulin for you. I'm
Right.
sure that happens though, because the prison system's fucked. But a lot of the time, trans people are incarcerated for reasons they shouldn't be because of drug laws and laws surrounding sex workers and self-defense,
Exactly.
or like things they did to survive. Trans people are being put in mass amounts into these facilities and then being fucking degraded and abused for reasons that they don't deserve it.
Plus, even if it was a very like just reason to put them in jail, like say a trans person murdered someone
And not
in
out of
cold blood,
in cold blood.
um because you know, they were like, hey, I want to kill a person, and they did that, then obviously putting them in prison would be like a just course of action to take there. But then the problem comes from the fact that they're not being punished in the way that a cisgender prisoner would be punished. They're not being treated in the way that a cisgender person would be treated. And they're not being punished for being a murderer. They're being punished for being trans.
Yes.
And that's where the problem comes from.
Yeah. By making that separation, no matter what the trans person did, they are being subjected to like this cruel and unfair form of punishment and torture, which is morally wrong and honestly,
And also illegal.
Yeah, it's illegal. And like Aaron said, not punishing them the same as their cis counterparts is where the problem is. It doesn't matter what somebody did. It's like, again, it's like base terms. You can't misgender a trans person you don't like just because you think they're an asshole. You're a fucking terrible person then. They still deserve that respect. There are definitely people in the world I hate and I loathe, but no matter what they did, I will not misgender them, because that's a completely different story, because then you're not attacking them for what they did. It's you being transphobic.
Yeah.
You have to separate those two. Your punishment cannot be based in transphobia if you're trying to punish them for like a murder or punish them for literally anything. They can't be intertwined, because then it's not the same punishment.
You said it.
And then the real thing that honestly made me fucking go absolutely feral when I was looking at it is they have this little staff policies chart, and
Oof.
so there are 4 categories. Staff must use preferred pronouns, staff must use preferred name, staff must respect trans people, and there should be training about trans people. And so 1, 2, 3, 4. There are 4 states that say staff must respect trans people. The staff either doesn't have to use the preferred pronouns of the like trans inmate or their preferred name. So like then they don't actually have to respect them, which is fucking bananas. Like you can't have a rule saying you gotta respect trans people, and they could be like, but you don't have to refer to them how they prefer.
It's the most cisgender thing I've ever seen.
Like there's only one state at the time that said like you had to do all 4 of those things, and it was fucking Vermont.
Yeah.
But like that's just such a insane fucking concept. Like I'd almost rather the states just say no across the board. Like a couple of them just said like, no, you don't have to fucking give a shit about trans people.
Yeah.
Than say like you gotta respect them. But
also, I want to point out specifically while we're talking about this that because I looked at these little charts too, and California specifically was like, Yeah, we're okay doing like invasive genital searches on trans people, and like we're okay putting them in solitary confinement against their will, and we're okay like denying them access to hormones and surgery and all that. But our staff is like trained to respect trans people. So, and I wanted to point that out specifically because every time I talk to a cis person about an area of trans discrimination within the system, whether it's the legal system or the medical system or anything like that, they always have some kind of response with like an area or a place that they think is very progressive, despite the fact that trans people will actually be saying, like, no, it's not. And so when I saw all those things listed there for California, it made me think of that because I know that if I were to talk to any cis person about that, they would say that can't be true. California has gay rights. So I specifically wanted to point that out because it pissed me off.
Yeah, no, I really like that you brought that up because I think part of the reason cis people respond like that when we're trying to talk about it is because, especially involving like prisons and stuff, like there's a ton of other stuff we can bring up outside of prisons that cis people are just going to flat out like, but we're liberal in this state. We're a blue state.
Yeah.
Oh, whatever the fuck.
Yeah.
But specifically with the prison system is cis people by default hear prison for the most part. And as soon as we're talking about that, they immediately deem that the people in that system are worth less than everybody else. So they automatically just, no matter what you say, in their head, they're thinking, well, I don't actually care because they're in prison, so they're bad. So I don't have to keep up my good allyship to support people because the state deemed them as like a bad person or evil or vile because it's all performative at the end of the day for a lot of cis people. So that's why the mass majority can't have these conversations about what's actually wrong with systems and can't get into like not surface level conversations about trans rights and trans activism because they just can't fucking comprehend that cis people are actually privileged over trans people and more than just using the bathroom or being called their like name.
And it's the way that we look at minorities in this country in general. Like white society will always be waiting for like a black person to get arrested on a nonviolent offense so they can be like, well, they're not like, they didn't do it right, they're a dirty person, they're a corrupt person, and they deserve this treatment that we've been secretly longing to give them. It's how we treat immigrants in this country the second that like their legal status as an immigrant is questioned, and it's how cis people treat us as trans people the second that they have reason to suspect that we might be aggressive or that we might be engaging in criminal activity or that we might not like them. Just the second that they have any reason to suspect that, that is when they pounce because it gives them the excuse to do what they secretly want to do, what they've been told that it is their right to do.
And it's fucking disgusting. And like, it's just so fucking gross. And so many cis people, anybody of privilege, this goes for all bases, since we brought up more than just like cis people hating trans people, have to constantly unlearn this. And so many just refuse to acknowledge that. Like, you have to actively think every time and like unlearn things. And just so little people are committed because it's hard and because it's not surface level, it's not performative, it's actually fucking changing something. So many people are just like, well, I do enough, like I don't say the N-word, I think trans people should be able to go to the bathroom, I don't think we should like separate families at the border, and they're like, that's it, because they can just say that and there's nothing they have to actually change about their lives to go with that, honestly. But if they have to start rethinking how they're like viewing the world and actually like criticize things, that's when they just shut down, because then suddenly they're like, oh, I actually have to like use brain cells? Okay, you
Right.
stupid minorities. I'm gonna say a slur now.
Right. And while I'm sure that, like, there are also a lot of people who haven't had experience with the prison system, at least at this point in their lives, it's something that, like, you can relate that kind of thing that happens and that attitude towards trans people in prison with, as like, it's kind of an extreme example of a lot of smaller things that I think every trans person experiences in their life, you know, when you're talking to someone who thinks that they're very progressive or whatever,
Hmm.
and then you need them to be more inclusive in the workplace or in their classroom, and suddenly they act like they couldn't possibly do that, you know? They just don't know what to do. It's just too hard to change things. And you're sitting there and you're thinking, well, I know exactly what you could change to make this better, and I know exactly how you could do it. But you know that they're not going to, because it's not as easy as just like making a post on Facebook about trans people, you know what I
Hmm.
mean? They have to actually think about why they're saying and doing the things that they're doing, and they don't want to.
Yeah, especially because in situations like that, they have to start holding other people accountable. Like on Facebook, you just make the post, and like if someone tries to argue with you, you literally don't have to respond. You can just be like, "You're a bigot." But if like you have to start upholding policies and stuff, you have to actually like be like, "What you're doing is wrong."
Exactly. And with something as large as the prison system, and with the attitude that we have towards incarcerated people in this country, it becomes even easier to let things fall through the
Hmm.
cracks and to not hold yourself accountable and not hold other people accountable for the wrongdoings that are happening.
I think that's a really good like statement, Aaron.
I did some research on historical people in the trans prison system. I specifically focused on people before around like the 1930s, because that's when we started to have more awareness of trans people. That's when there started to be more like surgeries and more hormone treatments for trans people that like became commonplace and that worked. So I found a few people before that time, in Western society that I wanted to talk about. And one thing that I wanted to highlight was that, in addition to a lot of the stuff that we talked about, or that Isaac talked about, the modern consequences of being forced into the prison system as a trans person today, like the violence and the mistreatment, which have pretty much been going on forever. There's also the inevitability of being outed when you're arrested. And for trans people, especially before the 2000s, I think that was a gigantic safety risk, both in the prison and once they got out of the prison. So the people that I want to talk about, I have four people that I wanted to highlight. There's Mary Jones in the 1830s, Stella Peckham Clinton and Fanny Winifred Park in the 1860s to 70s, and Harry Allen Livingston in the 1910s. And all of these people were trans people who were arrested, sometimes multiple times, and as a result had their lives sensationalized by the media and were outed and treated with extreme disrespect. And yeah, but there are some patterns that I wanted to go over there. Basically, I wanted to first look at Mary Jones, who was a trans woman arrested for sex work. She was a free Black woman, and she would sleep with like wealthy white men and pick their pockets. One day, basically, she stole a wallet from a guy, and he found another man that she had done a similar thing to. And they decided that they were going to like get her for it, basically. And they did not know that she was a trans woman, to my knowledge, because she had like constructed like a device made out of leather, basically, for when she had sex, so that they would like think that she had a vagina.
Hmm.
Innovation. I mean, like, so, but once they arrested her, she was outed as a trans woman, and they put her on trial, and she went to jail, and then she got out of jail, and then they put her in jail again. And she was sentenced to hard labor, I believe, too, which I wanted to highlight specifically because she was a Black woman in the 1830s. And like, I mean, I think you can make some pretty obvious connections there. Oh yeah. So also a lot of the times when they would arrest these people, and I noticed this for pretty much like every instance that I looked at, and there are a couple other people too that I'm not including in here for like time constraints. They have this kind of like very fetishistic lens through which they look at trans people, and which they describe trans people, and they fixate on their clothing and on their demeanor and stuff. And especially for Mary Jones and for Harry Allen, they had this fascination with describing like how much Mary Jones looked like a woman, and how much she appeared to be a real woman, and like how female she was, while also at the same time ridiculing and condemning her. They came up with the nickname, they called her Beefsteak Pete in the press because of her like leather vagina. And they did not stop using it for her for 10 years. They were talking about her in the press for 10 whole years at least, referring to her almost exclusively by this nickname. They called her the Man Monster.
That's so fucking disgusting. Holy shit, that's vile.
It's absolutely fucking disgusting. It makes me so angry. And they made like a lithograph of her in the press, and that was like, it was very popular because they could produce a bunch of images at the same time in the 1830s with a lithograph, and they would sell them to people. And it had a picture of her she was wearing a white dress with like little blue flowers, and it was like very decent. It was very modest. It was like in style for that time. And she had her hair all done up, and she had like a little purse, I think, and underneath it they have like the caption, they're like the Man Monster. And I think they put her dead name under there too. Here.
Christ.
Yeah.
Christ.
So they say the Man Monster, and then they have her dead name, and then they're like alias Mary Jones. Yeah. And she was sentenced on the 18th of June in 1836 to 5 years imprisonment and hard labor. Right. And this followed her throughout her life, because after she got out of prison, they were still writing about her when she hadn't committed a crime. She got out of prison and she went back to like living as a woman, and, you know, just walking around downtown, basically walking around the street. And these articles start coming out like the notorious Beefsteak Pete seen lurking around again, still at his old ways with his women's clothing. Right. They would not leave her the fuck alone. And this happened also, although to arguably a less extreme, with Harry Allen, who was my main reason at first for wanting to do this topic, because I read about him a long time ago, and he's very well documented as a trans man in history, which is like indisputably documented as a trans man, which is a very, very rare occurrence if you've ever looked up any like trans historical figures. So I was really interested in him, and I wanted an excuse to talk about him, basically. But he was a trans man in the 1810s. He started living as male when he was in his teens, and the press documented him from the time he was 18 and started living on his own up until his death in 1922. And that was for things like, I think, he stole horses, he went into bars wearing men's clothing. Both of those things were illegal for him at the time. And they would arrest him for things like wearing suits in public, or petty theft, or starting fights. And the media covered everything. And every time he was arrested, they would go to see him when he was being let out of jail, and they would write an article about it. And they would describe his clothing, and they would describe how handsome he looked. And they would take quotes from him. They would take direct quotes from him talking about his gender and saying, I am a real man. Treat me like a man. Call me a man. I've always lived as male. I've always seen myself as a man. I've always looked like a man. I am one. And they would take these quotes and they would put them in the paper alongside his dead name and misgendering him and talking about his sex, calling him a freak. And they would do these things, making it difficult for him to like live and find employment and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
He moved around a lot. And because he was born into like a lower class family, and because he was trans, that made it even more difficult for him to like find legal work. So he was involved in a lot of like criminal activity. He was involved in, I think he was involved in like bootlegging in like the early days of it, but he died pretty early into the 20s. So, and they documented all of this, and they went after, once they like got a hold of him because of his arrests, basically, his initial one, I think, when he was a young man, the police found him in a bar and like clocked him basically and started chasing him. And when they found him, they were like, "You're not allowed to wear men's clothing." And he was like, "Of course I should be allowed to wear men's clothing. It suits me so well." And they thought that that was like, you know, the media saw that and they were like, "Oh, he's like a little freak and he's ballsy and he's charming and he looks just like a real man." So they started like writing about him. And from that time, that encounter with the police, they would not leave him alone. They documented his personal life too. He had 2 girlfriends within like a 3-year span, and both of them committed suicide. They documented that. They blamed him in the press for it, saying that like he drove them to suicide because of like secretly being a woman.
God.
And they documented the time when he was stabbed in the back, literally, by his abusive father, and it punctured his lung and he almost died. And they just trailed him his entire life and he couldn't get away from them. And I have like, they have all these, like, a bunch of the news articles about him are like online, and I've been reading them. And I read this one instance after one of his arrests. He got out and they were talking about him and they were using his dead name and calling him a woman. And they were like, and he would change his last name too. It was Harry Allen and then it was Harry Livingston, and he would change it to try and get away from them. And they found him and they were like, he, like, dead name, edit again. And the night after his arrest, he went out and he got drunk and he went to the editor's house and he begged them to make a statement in the press retracting the things that the article said about them. And he was like, "You have to take it back. I'm a real man. This is not me. Like, you have the wrong person." And they just laughed at him.
Oh my God.
So, yeah, there are some like patterns here, I feel like, especially with their like sensationalization of these people, and as well with Stella Peckham Clinton and Fannie Winifred Park, who were 2 trans women in like the 1860s and 70s. And they were arrested for, they would, you know, dress up and they would go to the opera and they would go to the races and stuff. And they had like wealthy sugar daddies, and they were arrested. They were forced to appear at trial in women's clothing, in the clothing that they were wearing at the time of their arrest, which I think is like another example of the way that they basically, cis people basically become fascinated with our gender and with our gender presentation, and they use it against us whenever they can. And they use it against us in the prison system and in cases like these, regardless of our wishes. So they force them to appear in the clothing they were wearing the night before. And then, you know, the next day, all the articles come out about them, and it's like describing them as like hideous and outlandish and
Christ.
basically like demonizing them and calling them disgusting in any way that they could, which is something that modern reporters and historians and anyone who would write about these things seem to take at face value. Which I find deeply infuriating, not to get too far off topic, just because we have letters that they wrote each other and that they wrote their suitors. We have letters from Fanny to Stella's husband, Lord Arthur Clinton, referring to him as like my sister's husband. And she and Stella knew each other very well. They were really close, and they spoke about each other with like genuine familial love. And still, when they're being written about in these things, that is not the portrayal of them that people are writing. People are writing about them exactly the way that these articles from like the 1870s were writing about them, just with more like modern language. And they're calling them like, they're describing the night of their arrest as like an audacious spree, and saying they're camping it up, and like calling them catty and attacking their personal relationships in any way that they could, attacking their relationships with their parents. And I'm bringing all of this up because a lot of these things were the direct result of these people being arrested. There are also a lot of cases of historical trans people that I know who lived out their lives in the same times, who lived out their lives completely stealth and were fine. And these people that I'm talking about were evidently trying to live stealth as well. Harry Allen is referred to as like the first out transgender man, but he wasn't. He was outed. And there's a big difference there, because all of these people were trying to just go about their own business, basically. And once they were arrested and forcibly examined, or they didn't pass and they were outed, they could not escape that. And that had like a very, very serious consequence even once they were finished with their prison sentences. You know, it drove Harry Allen to alcoholism and opium addiction, which he eventually died from. These people were like never able to live peaceful lives. When Lady Stella Peckham Clinton was arrested, her husband killed himself. And these people were just put through horrible, horrible emotional damage because of the way that the legal system and that the prison system treated them.
Sorry, I'm at a loss for words. Legal system ain't shit. Cis people ain't shit. Why can't... Ugh.
You're valid.
Thank you.
I think that the way that the legal system treats us today, even though the things that I talked about were much more of a serious consequence historically, or even like as recently up until like the 1990s, when being outed as a result of an arrest like was what got Brandon Tina killed and raped. And I think like moving on into like the 2010s, we've been seeing less of that as a consequence, but it's definitely still there, and vestiges of it are definitely still there. And I think that the way that the legal system sensationalizes us and the way that they fixate on our gender and our gender presentation is a huge factor in the discrimination that we face by them. And I think it's a huge factor in like the mistreatment of trans people within the prison system.
Yeah, I would have to honestly second everything Erin says, because the issues of the past aren't necessarily the same as they were. It still is present, and there's a direct influence on today's prison systems in dealing with trans people as they did in the past. Well, a lot of it was due to the media afterwards and the way that like they're outed. The systems have just moved into a more secretive location so the public can't see, but they're still just as obsessed with that language and regarding our bodies and making sure that we know, like the trans people specifically who are being victimized by the system, know that they think that way of us. Such as like how that one story about how all her hair was cut off, and how she was put into a special pod, and how places are like, you don't have to actually respect their pronouns or names, but we respect you. It's just a different way of making trans people out to feel monstrous and disgusting, but in a way that they can't even try to advocate for themselves because it's not being seen.
Exactly. Yeah, that was really beautifully said, I think.
Thank you. So that's all we have for this month's episode. We hope we were able to give you some insight about being trans and in the prison system.
Yeehaw. Yeah, and we found a lot of different like articles and stuff about this. A lot of the articles and data that Isaac mentioned at the beginning of the episode, and I have sources for the things that I talked about as well. So we will be picking our favorites from those and putting them in our further reading section for the Tumblr post for this month's episode. So you can go and find that, as well as our LGBT fiction recommendations for this month.
Yep. You can find us on Tumblr at gayasinstupidpodcast and on Twitter at gayasinstupid. We took a month off because we didn't take any time off from the holidays and we were both just busy. But I don't know why I fucking said that. But
We're
anyways,
back, baby.
Yeehaw.
Yeehaw.
But yeah, you can listen to us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or SoundCloud. All those links are always in our Tumblr post. I swear to God, this time I will get us on Google Play. I swear I'll do it after this month.
It's the last thing you do.
I swear. I keep saying I'll do it, but I never do it because I'm a lazy sack of shit.
I believe in you.
Thank you. If you enjoy our podcast, you can always give us a follow. You can send us asks about different recommendations that you think we'd enjoyed, or even if you have topic suggestions or just questions in general, we'd love to hear from you.
And you can tweet at us as well.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Yeah, that's really it. Quick shout out to my boyfriend for making us our intro outro song.
Woo!
Mwah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Guess this is it. See ya, fucking suckers.
See ya. Stay safe.
I don't know why I laughed. Bye.
Bye.
You can't see me, but I'm dabbing very fast.
I'm not.